Chris's heart raced as Officer Lawson's piercing eyes locked onto him. He could feel the officer's presence like a weight, suffocating him. "What's in that bag, boy?" The officer's voice cut through the air like a blade, and Chris swallowed hard, trying to keep his hands from shaking. His mind raced. Should he stay calm, or should he try to run? Before he could even move, Lawson took a step forward, and Chris knew something was about to happen. The whole neighborhood was watching, and this could end one of two ways. Would he walk away, or would this be the day everything changed for him? Chris had lived in the same area his entire childhood. A peaceful suburban town with streets lined with historic houses, children playing basketball on every corner, and the air smelling like freshly cut grass. It wasn't ideal, but it was home. He was 16 and had huge hopes of becoming a doctor one day. His mother always encouraged him that if he worked hard enough, he could get out of this situation. "Just keep your head down, stay out of trouble," she'd always say. However, it wasn't always simple to stay out of trouble. Chris was unlike the other kids in the area. He had a strong desire to learn and a promising future ahead of him, but life was not always fair. Every day, he had to try harder to prove himself, to demonstrate to others that he was more than simply another statistic. However, being a young black child in this community, people did not always view Chris as he saw himself. Officer Lawson, in particular, found this distinction problematic. It was not the first time Chris had encountered Officer Lawson. In fact, he had lost count of how many times the cop had stopped him for no apparent reason. Lawson was often watching him as he walked home from school or passed by the park. Chris would do his best to remain calm, but it was difficult. Lawson was always quick to accuse Chris of anything, such as loitering, despite the fact that Chris was only waiting for his friend to arrive. Or when he examined Chris's backpack for no apparent reason other than the fact that he did not appear like Lawson expected. Today felt different, though. Today, Chris had done nothing wrong. He was simply walking home with his books, looking forward to a quiet evening. But Officer Lawson had picked him out again, and something about his approach felt more ominous than usual. "Where are you headed?" Officer Lawson questioned, his hand hanging on his belt as if he were about to pull something out. Chris did not respond soon away. He wanted to shout at him and demand him to leave him alone. But he knew better. His mother had repeatedly advised him against dealing with officers such as Lawson. "Stay calm, keep your answers short, and just get out of there." Chris took a deep breath and attempted to hold his voice steady. "I am simply walking home, officer. I have not done anything." The officer did not appear to care. He took a step closer, his gaze narrowing as he examined Chris from head to toe. "I don't like your attitude, boy," he replied, his tone condescending. "You think you're too good for this neighborhood?" Lawson went forward, obstructing Chris's way and stating unequivocally that he would not let him go without a fight. Chris's stomach churned. This was more than simply a routine halt. Lawson's tone and stance indicated that it was personal, and he was aware that, no matter how innocent he was, the police could make life tough for him. He'd seen it happen to others black teenagers in the area, all wrongfully accused and treated as criminals solely because of their skin color. But Chris did not want to fight. He did not want things to go worse. He only wanted to go home. He had heard accusations about Officer Lawson, that he was not only prejudiced but also unclean. Lawson was rumored to have been involved in a murky controversy, but no one had proof. And Chris? He wasn't sure what to believe. He had enough on his plate just getting through the day without thinking about the officer's personal life. However, something about today felt different. Maybe it was Lawson's behavior, or perhaps Chris had had enough. He refused to let the cop push him around this time. There had to be a way out. The officer's eyes glinted with something wicked and vicious. "You think you're going to walk away from this, huh?" Lawson's voice became louder, garnering the attention of others around him. Chris's chest constricted. He could feel the neighborhood's eyes on him. People started to notice. Will this be the moment when everything changes for him? Chris could feel his rage rising inside, but he didn't say anything. Instead, He took a deep breath and remained firm, determined not to betray fear. He had no idea what would happen next. But one thing was certain. He was not going to allow Officer Lawson get away with abusing him this way again. Chris's heart raced as Officer Lawson drew in closer. The smell of his poor cologne reached Chris's nostrils, making him feel even more uneasy. It wasn't simply that Lawson was a cop. Chris had dealt with many officers previously. No, it was the way Lawson stared at Chris, as if he didn't belong or wasn't even human. "Don't play games with me, boy," Lawson said, his voice harsh and frigid. "What are you really doing here?" He was circling Chris now, making him feel confined. The streets were empty, the businesses were closed, and the sun was setting. The tension in the air was palpable, and Chris could feel every eye on him. Chris couldn't help but feel the injustice of the situation. He had not done anything wrong, but here he was, punished like a criminal for merely being present in a space that was meant to be his. He attempted to swallow his frustration, but it was difficult. It's very hard. Every time he looked at Lawson, the officer's face was like a wall, unconcerned about the hurt he was causing. "Is this really necessary?" Chris inquired, his voice tight yet calm. He attempted to meet the officer's stare, but Lawson simply sneered at him. "Do you believe you can just ask me questions as if I were a suspect? I am just walking home." Lawson scoffed and shook his head. "Yeah, you've been just walking home for years, haven't you?" He was getting more personal and delving deeper. "You folks always believe you're so innocent. But I know better. I know what you're up to." The remarks hurt Chris, but he couldn't show it. He had heard similar comments previously. It was one of the reasons he despised being stopped by Lawson. It wasn't only the questioning, it was also how the officer made him feel tiny. He didn't feel like he belonged in this town or area, despite the fact that it was his home. Racism was no longer hidden. It was all out in the open, and it hurt more than anything. Chris's hands tightened into fists by his sides. "I haven't done anything," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "You can't just treat me like this." The officer did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached for his radio and pressed the button, speaking into it while keeping his eyes on Chris. "Yes, I have a kid here. I'll need a backup." The words hung in the air, making Chris's stomach turn. Backup? What exactly was he talking about? He'd never felt more cornered in his life. Seriously? Chris didn't believe what he was hearing. "Are you going to call for backup just because I am walking home? Just because I am black?" The cop twisted his lips into a cocky grin. "You're making things worse, kid. Please admit it. You are not as innocent as you claim to be." Chris wasn't sure how to get out of this. He wanted to yell, fight back, and tell Officer Lawson just how he felt about him. But he knew it wouldn't help. His mother's voice rang in his mind. "Do not aggravate things. Don't give them any reason to hurt you." She'd always advised him to avoid conflict, but this was different. This wasn't just an argument, it felt like something bigger, far more dangerous. As the officer continued to loom over him, Chris tried to remain cool and concentrate on his breathing. He could hear faint sirens in the distance, which accelerated his heart rate. Will they turn up? Will this worsen? He thought of his mother, who was waiting at home, concerned about him. Would she even be aware of what happened? Lawson took a step back, looked Chris up and down as if he were trash. "You are lucky this time, boy. I have more important things to deal with." He gave a dismissive motion, as if he were letting Chris go. However, the tension did not end. Definitely not. "Go on then," Lawson snarled. "But remember, I've got my eye on you." Chris did not hesitate. He turned and began to walk away, his feet moving faster than usual, but his mind racing even more. What has just happened? Was he free? Or did the officer simply let him go, intending to find another excuse to stop him later? But as he walked, something in his gut told him that this would not be his last encounter with Officer Lawson. This was only the beginning. As Chris went away, he was unaware that a small crowd had collected on the opposite side of the street. A few others had witnessed the entire scene, and they weren't alone. A local reporter, who was filming a story nearby, captured the finish of the incident on tape. The officer's remarks, body language, and how he treated Chris were all recorded. The camera was rolling, and this small town's filthy secret would soon be revealed. This was not over. In truth, it was only the beginning. Chris had no idea that the truth about Officer Lawson was going to be revealed in a way that no one, including Lawson, could have predicted. Chris couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. As he walked home, Officer Lawson's comments hung in the air like a shadow, sticking to him with each step. His heart pounded in his chest, each pulse reflecting the strain of the situation. He knew he needed to keep walking and act normal, but his mind was repeating everything that had just transpired. The rage, the insults, the way Lawson discarded him as if he were nothing. He was unsure how much longer he could maintain his composure. It wasn't until the next day that things became even darker. Chris was sitting in his history lecture, trying to concentrate, when his phone vibrated in his pocket. He hastily checked under the desk to ensure the teacher was not looking. It was a text from Mike, his best friend. "Mike, dude, don't believe this. What about the cop from yesterday? His dirty little secret is in the news." Chris felt his heart skip a beat. He hurriedly opened the news website, his hands trembling. And there it was, breaking news. Police officer under investigation following racist incident goes viral. The report went on to explain Chris's encounter with police Lawson, how the police shouted racial insults, and how the incident escalated unnecessarily. It was all there what had happened the day before, but this time it was being broadcast to the entire town, if not the whole world. Chris briefly considered passing out. He was unsure whether he should be relieved, angry, or afraid. But just as he was starting to understand what this meant, another text arrived. "Mike, I believe you should know. Lawson is not happy. He is trying to fight back. They think he is seeking you for something else. Be careful." Chris felt a knot twist in his stomach. The police was already after him again. But this time, it wasn't just about what happened yesterday. It was about preserving his own reputation. Lawson had been exposed, and now he had something to prove. The very following day, when Chris came home from school, he noticed Officer Lawson leaning against his patrol cruiser, arms crossed and waiting for him. The street was quieter than normal, with the sun covered behind dark clouds that appeared to reflect Chris's attitude. When Chris saw him, his stomach plummeted. He didn't want another conflict. He had hoped, even prayed, that after seeing the video, everything would calm down and the cop would back off. But it was evident that Lawson was not done. He had a vendetta. Chris attempted to move past without making eye contact, but Lawson came forward and blocked his way. Well, he scoffed, his tone low and intimidating. "Look who's suddenly famous." Chris took a step back, attempting to calm his growing panic. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice shaky. "This isn't on me." But Lawson was not listening. He was too angry and concentrated on getting his way. "You think you can just go around making me look bad?" He took a step forward, his presence intimidating. "You are nothing but trouble, and I'll make sure everyone knows." Chris's heart raced as he understood that this wasn't just another encounter, it was a warning. As tensions between Chris and Officer Lawson grew, it became evident that the officer would not stop until he had totally discredited Chris, until the focus switched from his own misdeeds to the little kid he had unfairly targeted. Chris felt the walls closing in. He wasn't just battling for justice anymore, he was fighting for his life and future. And deep down, he knew he couldn't do it alone. Something needed to give. The air was thick with tension as Chris sat in his room that evening, staring at his phone screen. The news story about Cop Lawson had gone viral, but it hadn't convinced the cop to back off. If anything, it appeared that Lawson was doubling down to protect his reputation and dignity. Chris could hear the faint echo of sirens in the distance, a reminder that law enforcement's might is not easily broken. However, it was no longer simply about the police, it was about standing up for what was right. His phone vibrated again. It was another communication from Mike. Mike, dude, something's wrong. I heard Lawson is being investigated, but he's been acting strangely, showing up in places he shouldn't. He might be hiding something. Chris scowled and rubbed his sleepy eyes. He wasn't sure how much more of this he could handle. Officer Lawson was relentless, and he knew he wouldn't stop until Chris regretted standing up to him. But something felt wrong. If Lawson was hiding something, the tables might turn in his favor. The following day, the news took another surprising turn. A new video surfaced online, and it had nothing to do with Chris. Instead, it captured Officer Lawson in a private, off-duty moment. The footage was first unclear, but it soon became clear. Lawson had been caught on tape accepting bribes from a local business owner, which he had denied for years. The camera showed him taking cash-filled envelopes in exchange for turning a blind eye to illicit operations in town. The video was a huge hit, and it circulated quickly. Chris watched the video with his mouth open. This was it, the moment he had waited for. Lawson was finally caught in the act. The officer who had attempted to bring him down was now facing the consequences of his own actions. Chris felt a strange mix of relief and rage as he realized the power was shifting. The tables were turning. By the end of the day, Lawson's entire world had started to shatter. He was sacked from the force, and charges were being filed against him. The population was stunned, and many who had previously backed him were now calling for his prosecution. It was a spectacular fall from grace for someone who had so much power and influence. Chris could almost feel the weight release from his shoulders. For weeks, he had been the one under suspicion, and his life had been turned upside down. But now it was Lawson who was under scrutiny. Later that night, Chris received a call from his mother. Her voice was soft yet full of pride. "Chris," she replied, "I just heard the news. I'm very proud of you for sticking up for what's right. The truth always finds its way out." Chris grinned, feeling the warmth from her words. Not only did the community need to know the truth, but so did the entire world. And suddenly, the entire globe was listening. When Chris walked to school the next morning, the streets felt different. People nodded at him as he passed, and some even murmured words of encouragement. The controversy involving Officer Lawson was well publicized, and it was evident that nothing would ever be the same. But, as Chris reached the corner, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. Officer Lawson was standing in the roadway, facing away from him. Chris froze. The cop seemed different now, not as powerful or untouchable. Lawson turned slowly to meet Chris's gaze. For the first time, the officer's eyes were filled with defeat rather than fury. Chris did not say anything. There was no reason to. The cop had already received what he deserved. Karma had intervened, and the balances of justice had balanced. The following several days were a blur for Chris. The town was humming with the aftermath of Officer Lawson's scandal, and the local media couldn't stop talking about it. Chris had progressed from being the unfairly accused youngster to someone who had helped reveal the truth. The entire town had gathered behind him, offering support and encouragement. Lawson was arrested and accused with corruption, bribery, and misuse of authority. The cop who had previously intimidated and belittled Chris was now facing the consequences of his actions. Justice, which had before appeared to be beyond grasp, was now visible to all. Chris took a deep breath as he sat in his favorite position by the park, meditating on what had happened. He had been terrified, unsure how things would turn out. But, in the end, he had learned a valuable lesson. The truth always comes to light, and karma has a way of working itself out. Chris returned home that afternoon, and his mother greeted him warmly. "You got it, Chris. You stood up for yourself, and the world discovered what was really going on." Chris nodded, feeling the weight of everything lifted from his shoulders. The world may not always be fair, but he understood one thing for certain. Sticking up for what is right is always worthwhile. Moral of the story: it is not always easy to stand up against injustice. But no matter how powerful someone appears to be, the truth will eventually come out, and karma has a way of making things right. Patience and courage can lead to a victory beyond anyone's imagination.